One betrayal, two billionaires, and 76 million Americans holding their breath as it all unfolded. Live on CNN. Elon Musk, the tech titan once hailed as Trump's unlikely ally, made a move no one saw coming. A single sentence on social media, and everything shifted. And Vance? He didn't stay quiet. He didn't soften his words. In a broadcast now burned into the minds of millions, Vance did what no other Republican dared. He publicly confronted a billionaire for turning on the movement that made him. What happened next wasn't just a debate. It was a line being crossed. A moment where loyalty, ambition, and raw truth collided in front of the nation. But here's the deeper question. Beneath the sound bites and fury, who's really pulling the strings in America now? Before we dive in, a quick note. The story you're about to witness is a dramatization. While inspired by real public figures and current tensions, the events, dialogues, and confrontations have been fictionalized for emotional and educational impact. Because while the story may be imagined, the questions it asks and the emotions it stirs are very, very real. So buckle up, because once this broadcast begins, there's no hitting mute. Stay with us. Truth, loyalty, power. What you're about to see will challenge what you thought you believed. The green room at CNN wasn't built for silence, but that's exactly what it held in the moments before the broadcast. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. The digital clock on the wall clicked towards zero with every heartbeat. Vance sat stiffly on the edge of a modern leather couch, one that looked expensive but felt cold. A paper cup of untouched coffee rested on the table before him, steam long gone. The crew had brought it 10 minutes ago. He hadn't taken a sip. Around him, 3 staffers moved like cautious shadows. One adjusted his collar. Another whispered bullet points about military spending and free speech optics. A third tapped on a tablet, tracking social sentiment in real time. "Tapper might hit you with the Kelly quote," one aide muttered. "Just pivot to inflation. Tie it to Biden. Then wrap it in foreign policy strength, Trump's strength." JD gave a tight nod, eyes unmoving. His phone sat face down beside him, but he could feel it hum. A single vibration, then another, then a third. He flipped it over. The screen lit up with a push notification from X. At Elon Musk. "Trump's obsession with power has become dangerous. It's time to move on." JD stared. The words didn't make sense at first, not because they were unclear, but because they were impossible. Elon Musk, publicly turning on Trump? The room, as if on cue, stopped. Even the air changed. A stillness fell so heavy that the buzzing lights seemed to vanish. JD's lead aide leaned forward, eyes wide. "Is that real?" JD refreshed. The tweet was still there. Over 38,000 likes in 3 minutes. A storm was brewing, and Musk had just lit the first match. A producer stepped in through the side door. "You're up in 5. Nobody moved. For a brief second, JD felt every layer of his body go hollow. His skin tingled. His suit felt too tight. His chest constricted. Not from fear, but from uncertainty. This wasn't in the prep notes. This wasn't in the memo from the RNC. This wasn't supposed to happen. "Should we prep a response?" someone asked. "Should you?" JD raised one hand, quiet but decisive. "No, I'll handle it." But handle what? He didn't know if this was a mistake, a hack, or a declaration of war. What he did know deep in his political instincts was this. This wasn't just a tweet. It was a signal, and everyone in the country would be watching his reaction. Live. His mind raced through every headline that would follow. JD Vance dodges Elon Musk betrayal. Senator Vance wavers on air. Trump's loyalist cornered on CNN. He reached for the coffee, then stopped himself. His hand was shaking. For a man who had spent years crafting every word, rehearsing every position, building every inch of distance between his past criticisms of Trump and his current alliance, this was the crack in the glass. 2 minutes, the producer said. JD stood slowly, adjusting his lapel. He glanced back at the phone one more time. Under Elon's tweet, a top reply was pinned. It read simply, "Even Musk's jumping ship. Let's see if Vance has a spine." He exhaled through his nose, not because he was calm, but because he couldn't afford not to be. As he walked toward the studio doors, the lights outside shifted from soft white to blazing warm. Jake Tapper was already seated. The cameras were warming. The feed was hot in 3, 2, 1. But before JD stepped onto the stage, he paused. If I blink, he thought, they'll know. And then, with a jaw set tighter than steel and a storm of contradictions brewing behind his eyes, JD Vance walked into the fire. He stepped through the studio door, but the tension didn't stay behind. It followed him like smoke. The lights on set glowed brighter now, casting soft reflections off the polished floor. Behind the cameras, a half-dozen crew members murmured final cues into headsets, checking angles, balancing mics, prepping the opening shot. JD adjusted his jacket once more. He told himself it was for posture. The truth was he couldn't quite feel his fingertips. A soft tap on his shoulder. It was Marlene, his senior advisor, the only one in the room who'd been with him since Ohio. Her voice was low, controlled. "Forget the Musk tweet," she said. "Don't take the bait." He didn't answer. "Seriously, JD, focus on the message. The economy, foreign policy, national strength, not tech billionaires playing kingmaker online." JD's lips twitched. He wanted to agree with her. He wanted this moment to be as simple as the debate preps, the talking points, the internal polls. But it wasn't. Not now. Not with that tweet burning a hole in every screen across America. "I can handle it," he said finally, voice quiet. Marlene didn't push, but she noticed. His right hand, subtle but unsteady, rested near his lapel mic. A tremor, barely visible, but there. Not the nerves of a novice. The shake of a man who knows what's about to hit but walks forward anyway. Across the room, the floor manager gave the 2-minute signal, and in that sliver of silence, memory rushed in, not invited, but inevitable. The year was 2021. JD Vance stood backstage at a crowded rally in Youngstown. He hadn't expected it. He'd barely survived the primary. The room had been cold toward him all week. Then the crowd started cheering. Trump's voice boomed from the stage. "You want a real fighter for Ohio? A guy who learned the hard way, not the DC way? JD's your man. Stick with me, JD, and you'll never fall." JD had stood there frozen, caught between disbelief and calculation. That night, everything changed. Doors opened. Donors called. Headlines flipped. One endorsement, and the walls of his past crumbled under the power of Trump's shadow. Back in the studio, JD exhaled slowly. His eyes lifted toward the camera ahead. Red light still off. But soon, he knew what Musk's tweet meant. It wasn't just a criticism, it was a fracture. A crack between the new empire of tech power and the old empire of populist loyalty. And if he stumbled tonight, he wouldn't just bruise his image. He could bleed support where it mattered most. From behind the monitor, Jake Tapper was visible now, preparing notes, scanning scripts. Calm, collected. A man ready to ask the questions that others tiptoed around. 30 seconds, the floor manager called out. JD's hand finally steadied, gripping the edge of the chair. He had made a choice. He would answer the Musk question. Not dodge it, not dance around it. Whether it cost him or not. He sat taller, jaw set. But deep inside, a pulse of uncertainty remained. Would Trump see it as loyalty or betrayal? As the floor manager counted down, the red light blinked on. JD Vance looked straight ahead, knowing full well that the next 10 minutes could define everything he'd built and everything he might lose. The air in the studio held its breath, and then the cameras rolled. The red light blinked on. The silence in the studio cracked like glass under pressure. Jake Tapper's tone was calm, but his eyes were sharp. "Senator Vance," he began, with that familiar cable news cadence, "Elon Musk just tweeted, and I quote, 'Trump's obsession with power has become dangerous. It's time to move on.' You agree with him?" There was no warming up, no buffer question, no small talk. The first punch had already landed, and it echoed. JD gave a small smirk, subtle but rehearsed. His voice came out smooth, almost too smooth. "Well, Jake," he said, "I think what's dangerous is the inflation that's crushing working families in Ohio right now. What we should be talking about is Biden's weak foreign policy and how Americans are paying the price every time this administration fails to lead. Tapper didn't blink. You didn't answer the question. JD adjusted his tie. Look, Elon is entitled to his opinion. He's a smart guy, but I think he's missing the bigger picture here. President Trump, love him or hate him, stood up to China, rebuilt the economy, and kept us out of new wars. That's leadership. That's strength. The audience watching from home saw it immediately. The dodge. And Tapper, a seasoned operator, wasn't about to let it slide. So just to be clear, he said, voice steady but firmer now, you don't find Trump's recent comments about using the military against political enemies, people he calls the enemy within, to be dangerous? You're comfortable with that rhetoric? JD's smile didn't return. A flicker of tension moved across his jaw. What I'm comfortable with, Jake, he said slowly, is law and order. What I'm not comfortable with is letting far-left rioters burn down cities while the media calls it activism. The American people deserve peace in their streets. Tapper leaned forward slightly. He didn't say rioters. He said people who disagree with him politically, including sitting members of Congress, Nancy Pelosi, Adam Schiff. That's not a protest issue. That's a constitutional one. JD's fingers tapped once against the arm of his chair. The studio lights suddenly felt hotter, the air thinner. He took a breath. Look, I wasn't in the room when those comments were made, but they were made publicly, Senator, Tapper cut in. On live broadcasts, do you think it's appropriate for a former president to call American lawmakers enemies and suggest using military force on them? JD's practiced tone was beginning to fray. He shifted in his seat. I think we need to stop pretending that words are more dangerous than the actions of this administration, which is actively weaponizing the Justice Department to silence dissent. Tapper nodded slowly. Not in agreement, in recognition. He saw it, the pivot, the loop, the escape attempt. And yet, Tapper said, voice now cutting through like a scalpel, you still haven't answered the core question. Do you believe Elon Musk is right when he says Donald Trump has become dangerous? Yes or no? JD froze for a split second. It was subtle, but visible. His pupils flickered toward the camera, as if gauging the millions watching from living rooms, diners, offices, bars. His hands, now clasped tightly, sat still in his lap. He had been cornered, and everyone watching knew it. He straightened his shoulders. What I believe, he said carefully, is that we've lost sight of what real danger looks like. Real danger is a broken border, a collapsing economy, and global instability. Not a tweet from a man who still has the support of half this country. Tapper leaned back. That's not an answer, but it is a choice. The screen briefly cut to a wide shot. The lighting was perfect. The atmosphere was tense, and the audience, on screen and off, could feel it in their bones. This wouldn't be a clean escape, and somewhere off camera, Elon Musk was still tweeting. Jake Tapper didn't shift tone, but his next words landed like a second strike. General John Kelly, Trump's own former chief of staff, said he was alarmed when the president suggested using the U.S. military against Americans. His exact words, that's what dictators do. He called Trump an authoritarian. Your response? J.D. Vance didn't flinch, at least not visibly, but he felt it. That familiar tightening in the chest, like his ribs were bracing against something too large to hold. He responded with a short exhale, then delivered the line they'd rehearsed. Well, Jake, he said, smoothing his voice again, John Kelly's been very vocal since leaving the administration, but let's be honest, he's a disgruntled ex-staffer. The man's had issues with Trump since the day he left the White House. Tapper didn't interrupt. He let the air thicken. JD continued, I respect his military service. No one's denying that, but just because someone wore a uniform doesn't mean they're above political bias. Let's not pretend Kelly hasn't had his own ambitions. There it was, the pivot, quick, controlled, deflect and downgrade, but this time something felt off, even to JD. For a half second, a sliver of memory cut through the tension, sharp, uninvited. It was the summer of 2020. JD sat in a quiet room in D.C., watching a clip on his laptop. Trump stood before an American flag, his voice sharp, unmistakable. The far-left lunatics, the enemy within, they want to tear down everything we've built. But I have a message for them. We won't hesitate to use the force necessary to protect our country. JD had paused the video, rewound it, played it again. He remembered feeling a flicker of unease. Not panic, not outrage, just attention. The kind of feeling you ignore when your phone buzzes with polling data showing your approval rating ticking up after a rally. He closed the laptop, dismissed it as campaign bravado, and moved on. Back in the studio, Tapper leaned in, his voice low but deliberate. So a retired four-star Marine general who lost his son in combat, served in 2 administrations, and was in the room with Trump daily, gives a public warning, and your response is to question his motives? JD forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I'm saying, he replied, that we should focus on facts, not personal vendettas. General Kelly has disagreed with Trump on a lot of things, mostly foreign policy. That doesn't make him the final word on what's constitutional or not. Tapper raised an eyebrow. He wasn't talking about policy. He was talking about using the military on U.S. citizens. JD straightened his posture. He was talking about rioters, people burning cities, not voters, not peaceful Americans. And yes, I stand by Trump when he says we need law and order. That's not authoritarianism. It's responsibility. But even as the words left his mouth, JD felt something in his gut pull taut. It wasn't the argument. It was the memory of brushing off the warning, of pretending not to hear what he clearly heard. The audience at home couldn't see that, but Jake Tapper could. He leaned back, tapping his pen lightly against his notes. Well, Senator, he said evenly, a lot of people are watching tonight. Some who served, some who lost family, and some who just want to know if the Constitution still matters when it's your guy in charge. JD said nothing. The silence wasn't long, but it was loud. Tapper didn't let the silence sit too long. He leaned slightly forward, not in aggression, but in calculated focus, like a chess player who already sees the checkmate 3 moves ahead. So just so we're clear, he said, his voice steady, almost too casual, you're saying General John Kelly, former Vice President Mike Pence, and National Security Advisor John Bolton are all lying? JD's jaw tensed. He knew the question was coming eventually. But not this soon. Not this bluntly. He paused, just a second too long. I'm saying, he began, that these are individuals who, after leaving the administration, suddenly found it convenient to criticize the very policies they once supported. It's political repositioning, Jake. That's not new in D.C. Tapper tilted his head. So they're all wrong, and you're right. JD's lips pressed tight for a moment. Then he leaned in slightly. They're wrong about Trump, yes, because let's not forget, many of these people were part of the same military-industrial worldview that kept us in endless wars for decades. Trump challenged that. He said no to the global policing strategy, and that made enemies. There it was, the defense. Polished, sharp, emotionally loaded. But it wasn't the answer the audience at home was looking for. Not after the words, use the military on Americans, had been echoed just moments before. Tapper pushed again, his tone firmer now. So your argument is, Trump is being attacked not because of his actions, but because he refused to go to war? JD nodded. Exactly. Trump's the first president in a generation who didn't start a new war. You'd think that would be a good thing. But when he talks about using the military at home, on U.S. soil, against political rivals, critics, even elected officials, that's not what he meant, JD cut in, a little too fast. His voice, once measured and steady, now wavered. Thin, almost sharp. He was talking about rioters, about people burning cities. He wasn't talking about everyday Americans. Tapper didn't move, didn't react. He just let the words hang there. JD's throat tightened. He could feel it now. Not just the heat of the lights, but the weight of being outnumbered. Not by Tapper, not even by the generals and officials he was discrediting, but by the reality that the people watching, millions of them, had heard the same words he had. And not all of them were going to accept this version. In living rooms across America, TVs buzzed in low-lit silence. A veteran in Tennessee leaned forward in his chair. A single mother in Michigan paused mid-dish. A retired school teacher in Florida furrowed her brow. No one reached for the remote. On screen, JD shifted in his seat. I just think, he said, voice catching slightly, that when people lose power, they lash out. That's what this is. Tapper leaned back, pen now resting flat on his notes. So again, for the record, John Kelly, Mike Pence, John Bolton, they're all part of some coordinated attempt to bring Trump down? JD hesitated. They represent a mindset, one that's more interested in preserving the old order than listening to the people who put Trump in office in the first place. He tried to hold eye contact, but it flickered. Tapper didn't nod. He didn't need to. The weight of what had just been said, or left unsaid, was already settling. The air inside the studio didn't move, and neither did the eyes watching through the screen. 300 miles from the studio, in a quiet suburb outside Dayton, Ohio, the interview flickered on a dusty living room television. The house smelled faintly of coffee and old wood. A flag, folded into a triangle and encased in glass, sat on the mantel above the fireplace. 3 generations filled the room, a high school senior in a hoodie, her mother curled on the couch with a notepad in her lap, and her grandfather, Thomas Kearney, retired Marine Corps, Vietnam, Bronze Star. He sat forward in his chair, elbows on his knees, boots planted firm on the rug. J.D. Vance's face filled the screen, his voice firm but visibly strained. They represent a mindset, one that's more interested in preserving the old order than listening to the people who put Trump in office in the first place. Thomas didn't say a word, not at first. He just reached for the remote, pressed mute, and let the silence stretch. Then finally, I fought for this country, he said flatly, not to see generals called liars by politicians who never wore the uniform. His daughter looked up. Dad, he's saying it's about politics, not the military. No, Thomas replied, sharper now. He's saying men who risked their lives, buried their own sons, don't get to speak unless they play party puppet. The granddaughter watched him quietly. She didn't know the full history, but she knew this. Her grandfather didn't get angry easily. And when he didn't raise his voice. He cut through. Thomas stared at the screen, at J.D. Vance's carefully composed face. Whatever fight he thinks he's winning, he muttered, he's already lost something bigger. Back in the studio, the silence was no less telling. J.D. sat straighter now, but not with confidence, more like rigidity. He wasn't leaning into the moment. He was bracing against it. Across from him, Tapper didn't speak. He didn't need to. His expression said more than any rebuttal could. You know they're watching. You know they're hearing you. And you know they're not convinced. JD's gaze dropped for a half second. Less a retreat, more a flicker of internal static. He was no longer answering Jake Tapper. He was defending himself from himself. Behind the lights, behind the prep memos, beyond the soundproofed walls of the studio, he could feel the millions of living rooms, like Thomas Kearney's, where silence was louder than applause. His voice was still speaking. Technically, he found himself reaching for old language, fallback lines, borrowed conviction. The American people want strength, not surrender. They want a president who doesn't apologize for putting America first. But even as he spoke, his words felt outdated, echoes from a campaign 2 years past, thrown into a moment that demanded something more. Tapper finally leaned forward again. Do you believe, personally, that people like General Kelly, Mike Pence, or John Bolton hate America? Or is that just the story you're paid to tell now? JD opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated. He wasn't prepared for that question, not because it was aggressive, but because, deep down, he wasn't sure anymore what he believed. He glanced toward the camera again, but this time, he didn't see the lens. He saw a reflection, and it looked back at him. The door clicked shut behind him. JD didn't bother turning on the lights. The hotel suite was high above the city, glass walls framing a midnight skyline, but all he saw was his own reflection in the window, vague and blurred. A man in silhouette, still wearing the same suit, still carrying the same tension. He dropped his phone onto the dresser. It buzzed again immediately, glowing with a flood of notifications. Twitter was on fire. Some were calling him fearless, others spineless. A video clip of him dodging Tapper's question had already been viewed 2.1 million times. One account called it the art of deflection. Another called it the moment J.D. Vance died politically. He sat down on the edge of the bed, removed his tie, and let it fall into a coiled mess at his feet. Then he reached for the phone again, almost by reflex, and scrolled. He's all in on the Trump train. No brakes, no conscience. At least he stood his ground. We need warriors, not whiners. John Kelly deserves better than that. J.D. sold his spine for a seat. J.D. set the phone face down again. He rubbed his eyes. His mind throbbed with the same headache he'd carried since the interview began. Not from fatigue, but from friction. The grinding of what he said versus what he felt. He stood up, wandered toward the bathroom, then stopped halfway. There it was again, the mirror. He caught his own face, half in shadow. The camera lights were gone, the studio pressure vanished, but something heavier remained. And now there was no audience, no advisor, no Tapper. Just him. His eyes locked onto the glass, the line of his jaw, the flicker of unease in his brow. And before he could stop himself, he whispered aloud, "Did I lie?" The question barely made sound, but it echoed inside his chest. He waited for something to follow. A rebuttal from his inner voice, a rationalization, even a shrug. But nothing came. Only silence. Only the thrum of distant traffic below. A wind shifted gently against the window. The city indifferent. Then, as if drawn by memory, his gaze dropped to the corner of the nightstand, where a photo still traveled with him on every trip. His son, aged 9, standing beside him on a fishing pier, holding a catch, smiling up at the camera. He remembered that afternoon like it was stitched to his ribs. They had just packed up their rods. The sun was going down. His son had looked up at him, thoughtful. "Dad," he'd said, "is being loyal always good?" J.D. had paused. "What do you mean?" Like, if your friend does something wrong, but you still protect him just because he's your friend, is that loyal or is that bad?" At the time, J.D. had chuckled, ruffled his hair. "You're thinking too hard, buddy." But now that question hit different. Is being loyal always good? He stared back at himself in the mirror, hearing it again. Is that loyal or is that bad? There was no answer tonight, not one he trusted. He turned off the phone completely, slid it into the drawer, and sat back down in the dark. Outside, the skyline glittered in cold silence, and inside, J.D. Vance sat with the only man he couldn't spin, himself. The hallway was quiet when J.D. opened the door. He hadn't expected anyone. No room service, no staff, just air conditioning humming faintly through the corridor. But something else was there, taped neatly to the outside of the frame, a single envelope. No logo, no return address, just his name, handwritten in block letters, Senator Vance. He pulled it down slowly, stepping back into the room. The air inside was still heavy from the night before. He sat at the desk, the city lights filtering in behind him, casting long reflections across the polished surface. He opened the letter with steady fingers, but as he unfolded it, that steadiness dissolved. "Senator Vance, my name is Ronald Mathers. I served 22 years in the United States Marine Corps, 2 deployments in Fallujah. I was there in 2004 when General John Kelly stood on a rooftop under sniper fire to drag one of our wounded back to cover. He didn't flinch. I stood with him that day. And last night I watched you stand against him. Not because you disagreed on policy, not even because of Trump, but because you chose the easier target, one who wouldn't strike back. You don't have to respect every general, but you damn well better respect sacrifice. You talked about law and order, but some of us actually know what it costs to keep it. I'm not writing for a response. I'm writing because I had to say it. You stood in front of millions and you spit on a man who lost a son in uniform. That's not strength. That's shame. Ronald Mathers, USMC, Ret. J.D. didn't move for a long time. The paper crinkled softly in his grip as he read it again and again. His eyes scanned the lines, but the words felt heavier each time. The part about Fallujah, the sniper fire. He didn't flinch. That line echoed, stuck. J.D. had read plenty of angry letters before. Criticism was part of the job. Usually he tossed them into a folder, marked feedback, and moved on. But this one? This wasn't a complaint. It was a mirror, and what it reflected made his stomach tighten. His hand trembled slightly as he placed the letter flat on the desk. It wasn't rage that shook him. It was weight. The kind of weight that comes when a man realizes he's been measured not by his words, but by what he chose to leave unsaid. He looked out the window. The skyline hadn't changed. Cars still moved. Lights still blinked. But something inside him was different now, subtly, undeniably shifting. He thought back to the studio, to Tapper's stare, to the wordless disappointment behind it. He thought back to his son's question, is being loyal always good? And now he thought of Fallujah, a rooftop, a wounded Marine, and a general who didn't flinch. JD leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. The letter still sat open, unanswered, unavoidable. He didn't crumple it, didn't toss it. Instead, he folded it neatly, carefully, almost reverently, and slid it into his briefcase beside the notes he'd written for the interview. 2 sets of words, one scripted, one real. He knew which one would stay with him, and deep down, he knew. This wasn't the last reckoning. It was the first. The letter sat on the desk like a sealed verdict. JD had reread it twice more, though he'd already memorized every line. The silence in the room wasn't peaceful. It pulsed with everything unsaid. He rubbed his hands together, trying to chase the ache from his knuckles. It didn't help. He reached for his phone. A contact sat pinned at the top. DT, personal. He stared at it for a few seconds, then tapped. The line rang. Once, twice, 4 times. Voicemail. You've reached the voicemail box of 45. You know what to do. JD waited a beat, then spoke. Low. Sir, it's JD. Just wanted to touch base. I know the Musk thing blew up, and the interview got rough. But I stood firm. I stayed on message. Let me know if you need anything cleaned up. Happy to handle it. Talk soon. He hung up, thumb lingering on the screen. There had been a time when Trump would answer within minutes, sometimes seconds. A late-night text, a 3-word directive, a thumbs-up emoji. But tonight, nothing. JD tossed the phone on the bed and sat back, arms crossed. The silence wasn't just quiet. It was strategic, calculated. He knew what it meant. Trump was watching, measuring, and choosing not to respond. By morning, the world had moved, but not in his direction. His phone buzzed at 6:42 a.m. with a flood of alerts. Twitter, news apps, political blogs. JD blinked the sleep from his eyes and tapped into the feed. At the top, Elon Musk. On Elon Musk. Blind loyalty is what destroys nations. Some people still don't get that. 6:38 a.m., 128.4K likes, 42.7K retweets. JD stared at the screen. His name wasn't in the tweet, but he was tagged, directly, publicly. The subtext wasn't subtext anymore. He read it again, slower. Blind loyalty is what destroys nations. The backlash came in waves. Commentators retweeting with commentary. Was that aimed at JD Vance? Senator Vance gets torched by Musk. Is Musk breaking the MAGA machine from within? He tapped into the replies. The top comment was a photo of JD's face during the Tapper interview. Mouth slightly open, eyes off center. The caption, when the camera sees the crack before the man does. The ache in JD's stomach tightened. He opened his inbox. Nothing from Trump's team. He checked text threads. No messages from campaign strategists. No RNC follow-ups. Marlene, his senior advisor, had sent a brief, let it breathe. Don't respond yet. But JD knew the game. Silence wasn't passive. It was pressure. Let the narrative churn. Let the loyalists squirm. Let him wonder how far the leash still stretches. He walked to the window, phone still in hand. Outside, the city was already moving. Traffic blinked in patterns. People were heading to work, to school, to vote. And while the machine of everyday America churned quietly forward, his political reality sat still, cold and undecided. He thought of the voicemail, of Trump's voice, casual and confident, pre-recorded in a time when JD still believed access was protection. Now, Now he wasn't sure he'd ever hear that voice again. Not directly. Musk's tweet was everywhere, but it was Trump's silence that screamed the loudest. JD lowered the phone and stared out at the skyline, the glass reflecting something he didn't want to name. And for the first time since the interview aired, he felt alone. The air in Ohio always felt different, thicker, heavier, grounded, like it carried the weight of something older than headlines. As JD stepped off the black SUV and into the lot of the Middletown steel remanufacturing plant, he inhaled deep, as if trying to pull confidence back into his lungs. The town hall wasn't large. Rows of folding chairs, thermoses steaming on tables, a PA system wired too close to the HVAC. Blue-collar pride coated every surface. Faded union posters, flags hung with care, and worn work boots lined neatly outside the door. These weren't people who shouted online. They showed up. They remembered. JD had campaigned here before. Shook hands. Promised steel jobs wouldn't be forgotten. Promised that Trump cared. Promised that he'd fight for them when others turned away. He stepped inside, nodding to familiar faces, adjusting the cuffs on his jacket. A few clapped. Most just watched. The moderator gave him a warm welcome, read off a few pre-screened questions, and JD answered them with familiar rhythm. Infrastructure, deregulation, taxes, a chuckle here, a firm nod there. Safe ground. But then came the break. A man in the third row stood up without being called on. Broad shoulders, retired army cap. Deep-set eyes. JD recognized him. Paul Brenner, former plant supervisor, 2 tours in Afghanistan, known in the county for organizing veterans' job fairs. The room shifted as he stood, like something quiet had just become serious. Paul didn't hold a mic. He didn't need one. "Senator," he said, voice calm but loaded, "why did you go on national television to defend a man who insults the uniform?" The room fell still. JD blinked. Paul wasn't yelling. He wasn't accusing. He was just asking. But the weight of it hit harder than anything from Jake Tapper or Elon Musk. "You called General Kelly disgruntled," Paul continued, "a man who's buried his son with a folded flag. You said Mike Pence turned because of politics. Sir, are you telling us that all these veterans, these men who served under fire, are just bitter because they don't like Trump?" JD's throat tightened. His usual response, the pivot to policy, the reassurance about inflation, the line about peace through strength, hovered on his tongue. But it didn't come out. His fingers flexed at his side. He glanced around the room. These weren't pundits. These were men and women who lived by a different code, who remembered sacrifice not in metaphors but in names, who heard what he said on TV and didn't hear strategy. They heard betrayal. For the first time in a long time, JD Vance didn't have a scripted answer. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then said quietly, "That's a fair question." He looked at Paul, really looked at him, not through the lens of polling or public messaging, but as a man who had served, who had lost, who had every right to ask. JD took a breath. "I said things on that stage to protect a position, not to protect people. I can't take the words back, but I hear what they sounded like, and I hear you now." Paul didn't nod, didn't smile. He just sat back down. And the room stayed quiet, not angry, just watching. JD knew then. He didn't need Tapper or Trump or Twitter to test his conviction. Ohio just did, and it was waiting to see what came next. The ballroom was a world away from the steel town hall in Ohio. Crisp white linens, gold flatware, glass chandeliers that hummed quietly overhead. Waiters moved like choreography, pouring wine with silent precision. Outside the French doors, the skyline of Cincinnati shimmered against the river. City lights reflected like stars pulled downward. JD Vance stood near the fireplace with a tumbler of bourbon, surrounded by suits and pearls and practiced laughter. The fundraiser had drawn some of the state's most generous conservative donors, CEOs, law partners, old guard political financiers. They all greeted JD like an investment they were hoping would finally pay off. A retired energy magnate leaned in over crab cakes. "Good job with Tapper. Tough spot, but you didn't flinch." Another clapped him on the back. Musk's just throwing punches to look independent. You played it smart. Loyal. JD nodded, smiled, thanked them all. He could do this part in his sleep. Toasts, handshakes, nods at the right lines. But when he stepped aside to refill his drink, someone followed him. Not with a compliment, but with a calculation. Walter Keene. Old money, older instincts. The kind of GOP donor who didn't say much in public but made calls that moved the map. He approached with a half-empty glass of red wine and a voice low enough not to carry. "Trump's fading," he said simply. "You better jump ship before it sinks." JD let out a short, practiced laugh. "Now, Walter," he said, "you sound like a Politico headline." But Walter didn't laugh back. He just swirled his wine and stared through him. "I've seen this before. Reagan in '88, Bush in '92. There's a rhythm to when power starts to turn stale. You can ride it too long and go down with it, or you can get ahead of it and look like a leader when the dust clears." JD took a slow sip of his drink, masking the tightening in his jaw. He'd heard this kind of talk in closed rooms before, but it had always been speculative, theoretical. Now it felt like a quiet shift in wind direction. No outrage, just arithmetic. Walter continued, voice just above a whisper. "Don't mistake applause for permanence. If Trump loses control of the narrative, the people following it won't wait. They'll look for someone who can say what he said without being who he is." JD met his eyes. Calm, steady. "And you think that someone's me?" Walter didn't blink. "I think that someone could be, if you stop apologizing for a man who never apologizes for you." JD's smile didn't break, but something under it cracked. He turned back toward the main room where laughter swelled near the bar. Waiters cleared plates. Jazz spilled from the overhead speakers like water over glass. Everything here sparkled. Everything felt safe, predictable. But he couldn't stop thinking about the factory floor in Middletown. The veteran's voice. "Why did you protect a man who insults the uniform?" The letter in his briefcase. "That's not strength. That's shame." And now this. A whisper in a silk-wrapped room telling him that even loyalty had an expiration date. He looked down at his drink. It had gone warm in his hand. He let out another soft laugh. Not for Walter, not for anyone else, but for himself. Because somewhere deep inside, beneath the rehearsed certainty, he knew Walter was right. The next morning, the hallway outside JD's Cincinnati field office buzzed with the quiet efficiency of too early ambition. Aides walked briskly with clipboards, coffee cups sloshing, printers humming in the background. JD stood near the back conference room, blazer slung over one shoulder, mind still echoing with Walter Keene's voice from the night before. They'll look for someone who can say what he said without being who he is. He hadn't slept much. He wasn't sure what bothered him more, the warning or how much it made sense. "Senator?" a soft voice said behind him. JD turned. It was one of the interns. He couldn't remember her name, only that she was from the university downtown. Maybe poli-sci, maybe journalism. She looked impossibly young in the harsh morning light, clutching a manila folder to her chest like it might escape. "I put this together last week," she said. "Didn't know if you'd want it." She extended the folder with both hands. JD took it, more from habit than curiosity. "What is it?" "Policy notes," she said plainly. "Not responses, not media prep, just issues. What voters are asking about." Then she paused, nervously adding, "Real ones." JD raised an eyebrow, surprised. He opened the folder. Inside, bullet point breakdowns. Housing costs across Appalachian counties. Overdose rates from synthetic opioids. Fentanyl numbers triple what they were 5 years ago. Charts on wage stagnation. Healthcare coverage gaps by zip code. Childcare availability. Rail safety inspections. None of it packaged for a soundbite. All of it urgent. No bold headlines. No Trump quotes. No mentions of Musk. Just people. Problems. Data. Real life. JD flipped through the pages slowly. They weren't flashy, but they were honest. Each line a window into someone's world. Far from the CNN studio, far from donor dinners, far from Twitter. He muttered under his breath, almost without meaning to, Why aren't we talking about this? The intern hesitated, then shrugged slightly. We used to. That stopped him. He looked at her fully now. Not just a name tag and a resume, but someone standing at the beginning of belief. Not yet cynical, not yet owned. You put this together yourself? He asked. She nodded. With a couple others on the research team, we thought maybe policy should matter again. JD didn't respond right away. He closed the folder gently, like it contained something breakable. He wasn't sure what hit harder, the clarity of her work or the quiet sincerity behind it. For the first time in weeks, there was no one trying to impress him, no one trying to spin him, no loyalty tests, no calculations, just facts, and the question beneath them, what are you really doing here? Thank you, he said, voice low. She nodded and turned to leave. He watched her walk back toward the cluster of desks near the copy machine. Just another intern in a room full of staffers, and yet, her folder sat heavier in his hands than any endorsement. JD stood there a moment longer, then stepped into his office and shut the door. He laid the folder flat on his desk and stared at it like it might answer a question he hadn't yet dared to ask. The black car pulled up in silence just before dusk. No fanfare, no press trail. Just J.D. Vance alone in the back seat, folder in hand, suit slightly wrinkled from the long drive down from Ohio. This time, there was no entourage, no team whispering spin into his ear, no last-minute PR strategies shoved into his lap. Just notes. Typed, highlighted, scribbled on. Some from policy staffers, most from that intern's folder. The studio felt smaller than he remembered. Or maybe he felt larger. Not louder, not grander, just more rooted. Inside, the green room was still sterile and quiet, the same cold air vent humming in the ceiling. A production assistant handed him a bottle of water. You're on in 4, she said. JD nodded, but didn't touch the water. His eyes were fixed on the camera beyond the glass. Last time he was here, Elon Musk's tweet detonated like a bomb mid-briefing. Last time, his hands trembled, and his mouth said things his gut questioned. Last time, he was defending a man instead of a mission. Not tonight. The studio door opened. Jake Tapper stood there, half in shadow, half in spotlight, expression unreadable. His usual cool composure in place, but with a flicker of curiosity this time. Back for round 2, Tapper said as JD approached the set. JD gave a quiet nod. Let's do it. As he sat down, he didn't glance at the camera or the countdown clock. Instead, he opened the folder and laid it on the desk in front of him, not as a prop, but as armor. It wasn't filled with slogans. It was filled with lives. The red light blinked on. Tapper wasted no time. Senator Vance, he began, his tone crisp but not confrontational. Last time you were here, you spent most of the segment defending Donald Trump. Since then, General Kelly, Mike Pence, and John Bolton have doubled down on their warnings about his behavior. Elon Musk's comments ignited national debate. And you, well, your silence afterward spoke louder than any tweet. JD didn't flinch. Tapper continued. So tonight, let's try something different. Are you ready to stop running defense? There was a pause, long enough for producers to tense, long enough for millions watching to lean in. JD didn't smile. He didn't smirk or spin. He just looked up, calm, clear, and said, Yes. Tapper raised an eyebrow. So you've changed your mind? JD exhaled. No, I've changed my focus. He flipped the folder open, thumbing through a few pages. For the last 6 weeks, I've been caught in a loop, talking about personalities, playing referee between billionaires and generals. And somewhere along the way, I stopped asking what my job was really supposed to be. Tapper blinked, slightly caught off guard. JD continued. Do I still respect President Trump? In many ways, yes. He gave voice to people the system ignored. But respect doesn't mean agreement, and it doesn't mean obedience, especially when the stakes are this high. He held up a page. This is what Ohio's families care about. Overdose deaths are up 37% this year. Our rail system failed 3 towns in 4 months. These are the fights I should have been showing up for. Tapper leaned back slightly. That's a shift. JD nodded. It should have come sooner. There was no applause, no viral moment, just the rare stillness of a man not playing to win, but trying finally to mean it. The camera panned closer. For the first time in his public life, JD wasn't defending anyone behind him. He was speaking for the people in front of him. And somewhere, in a dorm room, an intern refreshed the live stream and whispered under her breath, "That's more like it." The studio remained unnaturally quiet after JD's shift in tone. Tapper didn't interrupt. The crew didn't breathe. Somewhere between the sentence and the silence, something had cracked open, and JD felt it in his chest. He looked down at the folder, then slowly up at the camera. "I defended Donald Trump because he helped me win," JD said, the words deliberate, weighty. "He endorsed me when few others would. He gave me momentum. He gave me voters." Tapper tilted his head slightly, sensing something bigger was about to land. JD's voice dropped, just enough to carry gravity. "But loyalty can't override truth." The moment hung in the air like a warning shot. Across the country, people reached for remotes. Phones buzzed to life. Hashtags launched themselves into orbit. One trending instantly, hashtag Vance breaks, ranks. In a diner in Kentucky, a waitress dropped her tray. In a living room in Florida, a retired Marine leaned forward in his recliner. In Mar-a-Lago, a remote control clattered onto a marble floor. Tapper raised an eyebrow, eyes narrowing. "That's a big shift, Senator." JD didn't blink. "It's overdue." And then a pause, a real one. "I don't regret serving my country," JD said, his voice thickening just enough for the mic to pick up a change. "But I do regret something else." He glanced toward the monitor, watching a 5-second delay of his own face. "I regret not speaking up sooner. I regret thinking the price of truth was higher than the cost of silence. Because it's not." There was no dramatic music, no cut to commercial. Just a moment that felt like it was echoing in every quiet home, barber shop, and back office that ever felt torn between belief and betrayal. Tapper leaned back slightly. "You know what this means, don't you?" JD nodded. "It means I'll lose people. Maybe a lot of them." Twitter confirmed it in real time. Within seconds, JD's mentions were a storm. "Traitor. Finally a spine. You just lost my vote. He's the only Republican I'd consider now." From the far right came fury. "Rhino, sellout, snake." From moderates came surprise. "Didn't see this coming." From the undecided came curiosity. In one Midwestern living room, a teenager turned to his father and asked, "Is he the same guy who said Trump would never lie to us?" The father, after a long pause, replied, "No, that guy just left the studio." Back on set, Tapper didn't push the moment. He let it sit. JD closed the folder. "This country is exhausted," he said, "not just from politics, but from pretending that truth is optional." A small red light blinked beside the camera, signaling wrap-up. JD stood, but not before adding one last thing, spoken softly. "Integrity doesn't erase the past, but maybe, just maybe, it can still shape what comes next." He left the studio with no aides, no notes, and no exit line. Only a firestorm waiting outside the glass doors. And, in some quiet corners of the country, a flicker of something else. Respect. The clip aired less than 7 minutes, but the aftershock stretched across every network and neighborhood in America. By sunrise, CNN's exclusive was repackaged, clipped, captioned, and dissected in real time. The image of JD Vance looking directly into the lens, saying, "Loyalty can't override truth," looped endlessly, setting cable newsrooms on fire. On Fox News, the tone was swift and scathing. One anchor, lips tight with disdain, called it a betrayal dressed as courage. Another panelist went further, slamming his papers on the desk. "This is what happens when Washington swallows another outsider whole." The Chiron read, "JD Vance turns on Trump. Or did he just turn on you?" Over on MSNBC, the tone was equal parts curiosity and vindication. One guest said, "For the first time, I'm listening to JD Vance, and not to argue." Another added, "This wasn't politics. It was confession." But not all reactions came from talking heads. In a high school civics classroom in Dayton, Ohio, the teacher paused her lesson and turned to the class. This aired last night, she said, clicking play. Watch closely. The room dimmed as the clip played on the overhead screen. Some students slouched. Some leaned forward. All listened. JD's voice filled the silence. I don't regret serving my country. I regret not speaking up sooner. Truth isn't a betrayal. Silence is. When it ended, a student in the back raised his hand, not one of the usual talkers. So, politicians can change? He asked, eyes cautious. The teacher didn't answer right away. She walked toward the desk, then turned and nodded slowly. The good ones can, she said. Not always. But sometimes when the country's tired enough, one of them remembers why they came in the first place. Another student whispered, he's still going to get destroyed online, though. Someone else muttered, yeah, but at least he said it. Thousands of miles away, a group of veterans gathered in a Legion Hall watched the same clip on a mounted TV. One of them, a gray-bearded man with a stiff right leg, grunted. Took him long enough, he said, sipping his coffee, but I'll take a late truth over a lifelong lie. In DC, campaign strategists redrew donor maps. In Silicon Valley, Elon Musk posted a one-line tweet. Truth told, late is still truth. Took you long enough, JD. Underneath, 84,000 likes, and rising. And in a quiet Ohio home, JD's son watched from the staircase, peeking at the living room TV. He turned to his mother. That's Dad, right? She smiled, holding back tears. That's the part of him he used to be afraid to show. The clip wasn't a political pivot. It was something rarer. It was a man blinking in the floodlights, unsure if the ground beneath him was cracking or clearing a new path. And America, for all its division, didn't look away. The glow of J.D. Vance's laptop screen lit the otherwise darkened study. It was nearly 11:30 p.m. in Cincinnati. Rain ticked lightly against the window. His tie was loosened, collar open, sleeves rolled up. One of those moments where exhaustion blurred into adrenaline. The day had been brutal, but not unexpected. Then came the post. Trump had just published on Truth Social, JD's soft. I made him. He turned. Typical. 3 sentences. No context, no room for nuance. Just fire, ignited publicly, intended to burn. JD stared at it. Across the screen, tweets were already pouring in. MAGA loyalists sharing the post, tagging JD with snake emojis and hashtag Traitor Vance. A few blue-check allies tried to defend him, but the tide was swift and sharp. Some called it inevitable. Others called it war. He clicked into his draft folder and opened a blank tweet. His fingers hovered, then began to type fast without pause. You didn't make me. You used me, like you used everyone who bled for this country while you dodged it. I stood with you because I thought you stood for something. I was wrong. He stopped. Reread it. The words pulsed on the screen like a dare. He imagined the headlines. Vance unleashes on Trump. The GOP breaks apart on Twitter, 280 characters at a time. Cable panels would explode. Morning shows would loop it to death. Supporters would scream. Donors would vanish. But maybe others would finally understand. JD moved his cursor to the post button, then paused. He sat back, took a breath. His hands trembled slightly, the same way they did before his first Senate debate years ago. Not out of fear, but restraint. The line between courage and impulsiveness was razor thin in politics. He'd walked it before. This time it felt sharper. He glanced at a photo on his desk, his wife and son, taken the summer after his book launched. That summer, he still believed he could be both honest and electable, that the system wouldn't demand pieces of his soul in exchange for relevance. His phone buzzed, a text from a friend in the Senate. Don't respond tonight. They want the reaction, not the reflection. He looked back at the tweet, read it again, then slowly, deliberately, he pressed delete. The screen went blank. The cursor blinked, quietly, steadily, like breath returning to the room. In the silence, JD opened a blank document and began typing. Not a tweet this time, not something for retweets or cable segments, just words, for himself, a reminder. Say less, do more. Truth doesn't always need a microphone. Sometimes it just needs time. Outside, the rain began to fall harder, But inside, J.D. Vance leaned into the quiet, letting the world rage without him. For now. Because sometimes the most powerful response isn't a punch. It's choosing not to throw one. 2 days after deleting the tweet that could have started a war, J.D. Vance walked through the heavy oak doors of the Senate Ethics Committee chamber. No cameras, no press. Just silence and polished wood, old oil paintings, and eyes that had seen too much to be easily moved. The hearing wasn't public, yet, but the stakes were no less real. The room smelled of paper and caution. Across the long table sat 6 senators, 3 from each party. In the center, a nameplate that read, Chairwoman Landis. She didn't smile. No one did. The charge wasn't criminal, it was political. The kind that left reputations bruised and futures uncertain. J.D. hadn't broken laws. He'd broken expectations. His defense of Trump, followed by his reversal, had angered both sides of the aisle. To some, he looked unstable. To others, untrustworthy. No matter what he said now, someone would call it theater. He took a seat. A voice cleared. One of the older members asked, Senator Vance, how do you explain your shifting public stance? J.D. paused. Everyone expected a polished rebuttal, a list of dates, perhaps a speech about media spin. Instead, he said evenly, I failed the first test. The room stilled. I defended a man out of loyalty, not to principle, not to truth, but to power. I told myself I was standing firm. I wasn't. I was hiding. Someone leaned back in their chair, surprised. He continued, this hearing isn't about one interview or one tweet. It's about whether people like me, elected by our states, still have the spine to admit when we've misjudged character. He looked up, meeting eyes across the table, steady and unflinching. I did. I misjudged his character, and I misjudged my own. From the side of the room, a young clerk shifted slightly. Even they weren't used to this kind of plain confession. J.D. reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a folded sheet. This is the first speech I ever gave as a candidate. I promised to be honest, even if it cost me. I'd forgotten that promise, but I remember now. A long silence followed. Some senators scribbled notes, others just stared. Landis finally spoke. Senator, do you still believe you belong in this chamber? J.D. didn't hesitate. Only if I pass the next test. This one, I failed. Someone tapped their pen twice, a subtle, quiet rhythm. And then from the back of the room, a sound no one expected. Applause, not loud, not long, but real. From one staffer, then another, and finally a low murmur of approval. It wasn't unanimous, but it was enough to matter. Landis didn't acknowledge it, but the moment lingered in the room like smoke. When J.D. stood to leave, no one stopped him. No reporters waited outside. But something had shifted, not on TV, not on Twitter, but in the air among the people who saw him not as a brand, but as a man standing, quietly, awkwardly, but unmistakably, for something again. And as he walked down the hallway past the busts of long-dead lawmakers and their etched ideals, he didn't look down. He didn't look back. Because sometimes the redemption doesn't come in a roaring crowd, but in a room with no microphones, no clapping soundtrack, just a sentence spoken plainly to those who needed to hear it. And for the first time in days, J.D. Vance didn't feel like he was performing. He felt like he was beginning. The hallway outside the ethics hearing had gone silent again. No aides, no statements, just the soft echo of J.D.'s footsteps as he made his way back to his office. The door clicked shut behind him with a dull thud, and he stood there for a long moment, jacket still on, eyes fixed on the framed photo near the window. His son, age 9, grinning wide with 2 front teeth missing and an American flag behind him. J.D. crossed the room slowly, sat at his desk. The buzz of the day, the questions, the applause, the quiet approval from staffers, all of it blurred into a single hum beneath his skin. But the moment that wouldn't leave him wasn't from the hearing. It was from years earlier, one spring night at the kitchen table, when his son had asked, Dad, do you ever say things you don't believe, just to keep your job? J.D. hadn't known how to answer. He gave some vague reply about responsibility, about how grown-up things worked, but the look in his son's eyes had stuck with him, like the kid knew that wasn't the truth, not all of it. Now in the solitude of his Senate office, JD opened the top drawer and pulled out a blank piece of paper. No title, no dear, just the weight of everything he hadn't said before. He began to write, "One day, someone will ask you to stay quiet. Maybe it'll sound polite. Maybe it'll come with a promise. Security, promotion, applause. Maybe they'll say it's for your own good. That speaking up would be reckless, rude, inconvenient. If that day comes, don't listen. Don't stay quiet. Because silence is where things rot. That's where mistakes become habits, where cowards become leaders, and where the truth forgets how to raise its voice. I know this because I failed that test. I stayed silent when I should have spoken. And when I did speak, I did it for the wrong reasons. Power, loyalty, fear of losing what I thought mattered. But here's the truth. If keeping your place means giving up your voice, then that place was never really yours. I'm writing this not as a senator, not as a man in a suit on TV, but as your dad. And I want you to remember this. More than anything I've ever said on any stage, if it ever cost you everything to stay honest, then everything was too cheap to keep." JD stopped, read it twice. His hand rested for a moment at the bottom of the page. Then he signed it with a simple dash. Dad. He folded it carefully, like he was tucking away something fragile. No envelope, just paper worn slightly at the edges from where his hand had pressed too long. He placed it in his top drawer, beneath a stack of memos and schedules, out of sight, but not out of reach. Outside, the Washington sky was starting to shift into dusk, a pale orange glow casting long shadows across the carpet. JD stood and looked out the window, not at the Capitol dome, but past it, towards somewhere quieter. He didn't know when his son would read that letter. Maybe years from now, maybe never. But it didn't matter, because the words were there now. And sometimes the most important speeches weren't spoken into microphones, but written in silence, waiting for the right moment to be found. The air in JD's Senate office felt different these days. Quieter. Not empty, just still. The kind of quiet that didn't need to prove anything. No reporters loitered outside the door. No staffers frantically rehearsing talking points. No buzzing from 3 phones at once. Just light from the window cutting across the desk and a low hum from the hallway beyond. And on the wall behind his desk, where there once hung committee commendations and campaign memorabilia, now sat a single frame. Visitors always noticed it. Some paused. Others squinted, unsure what to make of it. Inside the frame was a snapshot, an image of Elon Musk's tweet, captured just hours after JD's second appearance on CNN. The tweet, blunt as ever, read, "Blind loyalty is what destroys nations." Right below that tweet was a printed transcript, the exact words JD had spoken under the studio lights, voice steady, hands unclenched. "I defended him because I owed him. But truth doesn't work like debt, and I owed the truth more." That line had traveled fast. Talk shows, op-eds, even a civics exam in an Iowa high school. Some praised him, others said it was too little, too late. But JD hadn't framed it for them. Beneath the tweet and the transcript, etched into a narrow steel plate and mounted with care, were just 6 words, "The day I stopped spinning." He hadn't chosen those words lightly. They weren't dramatic, weren't poetic, just honest. For years, politics had felt like a revolving door of narratives. Adjust, defend, pivot, survive. The truth wasn't denied, it was delayed. JD had mastered the spin until one day he hadn't. The frame sat there not as a monument to pride, but to turning points, to the moment when he stopped looking for exits in conversations, when he stopped drafting statements designed to be safe instead of real. Occasionally, visitors would ask about it. One staffer once joked, "Why keep the tweet of the guy who called you out?" JD had just shrugged. Because he wasn't wrong. The room itself had changed. Fewer flags, more books. The loud colors of campaign life replaced with muted tones, almost like the office had exhaled along with its occupant. Every now and then, JD would glance up at the frame during late nights. Not to admire it, not even to remember, just to remind himself of the exact second he realized the job wasn't to win arguments, it was to outgrow them. It was just past noon when the school bus pulled to a stop near the Capitol. A cluster of high school students from Dayton, Ohio filed out, squinting up at the marble dome they'd only seen in textbooks. Their sneakers scuffed gently against the stone as they entered the rotunda, trailing behind their civics teacher, Mrs. Langford, whose voice carried just enough authority to keep them moving. They'd seen statues and heard stories. Jefferson, Douglas, a bust of Sandra Day O'Connor. But it wasn't until they entered one of the Senate wings that the group fell silent. A guide gestured toward a corridor of portraits, names the students had memorized for their final exam. But then a boy, tall, soft-spoken, tugged at Mrs. Langford's sleeve and pointed to a framed display just inside a Senate office window. Inside, a tweet, a transcript, and beneath them, a steel plaque engraved with 6 words. The student leaned in, reading aloud, "The day I stopped spinning." Another student asked, "Whose office is this?" The guide replied, "Senator J.D. Vance's." A few students exchanged glances. J.D.'s name was familiar, partly from the headlines, partly from the class debate they'd had last semester. One girl who had written her essay on political accountability stepped forward and asked, "Why would he frame something like that?" Before the guide could answer, Mrs. Langford quietly stepped in. "Because sometimes," she said, "the bravest thing a leader can do is admit they changed." She looked at her students, each of them suddenly more still than before. He stood by someone for years, but when the truth became clearer, he chose to say it aloud, even when it cost him. That frame isn't about ego. It's a marker of a moment he could have kept quiet, but didn't. The tall boy nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the tweet. "He chose truth over power," Mrs. Langford said. "Rare thing." No one spoke for a moment. The Capitol was alive with echoes, pages moving, tour groups shuffling, history being retold in 10-minute segments. But for these students, it wasn't just about history anymore. It was about the now, about what courage looked like in a suit and tie, behind glass and steel. They moved on after a few minutes, but the tall boy, Jason, lingered just a second longer. Before rejoining the group, he quietly pulled out a folded sheet of paper from his backpack, his own speech draft for the upcoming school contest. He reread his opening line and scratched it out with a pen. Then he wrote something else instead. Weeks after the Capitol visit, J.D. Vance sat quietly across from the host of a popular political podcast, the kind streamed by millions on their morning commute. The studio was modest, no flashing lights, no high-definition cameras. Just 2 microphones, a glass of water, and a single question that had waited months to be asked. The host leaned forward, voice steady but laced with curiosity. "Do you think Trump ever forgave you?" There was a pause. J.D. didn't rush his answer. He looked down for a moment, almost as if the question had come from someone closer, someone from his own past. Then he smiled faintly, not with confidence, but with something softer. Acceptance. "Maybe," he said, his voice low and even, "but I had to forgive myself first." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full, heavy with all that had come before. His defense, his reckoning, the long path from echoing a man's voice to finally finding his own. In that pause, there was no need to explain the tweet, the hearings, or the high schooler's quiet nod in front of his framed quote. J.D. glanced toward the window beside him. The morning sun touched the edge of the Capitol dome in the distance, gilding its marble with a shimmer that felt almost poetic. There were no camera crews waiting outside, no statements to issue, just the end of a conversation that mattered more than the headlines. The host didn't follow up. He didn't need to. Some answers didn't require expansion. They needed only space to breathe. As J.D. removed his headphones and stood, he nodded once to the producer in the booth. It had been a long season of noise, but for the first time in a while, the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt earned. This story reminds us that real courage isn't about shouting the loudest. It's about knowing when to stop spinning, stand still, and speak honestly. J.D. Vance's journey isn't just political, it's profoundly human. He wrestles with loyalty, silence, and the high price of telling the truth in public. And in a world where power often rewards performance, his choice to pause and reflect feels quietly revolutionary. What stays with me most isn't the clash on CNN or the backlash. It's that final, vulnerable sentence. I had to forgive myself first. Because at the heart of every redemption is not approval from others, but the peace of looking yourself in the mirror without flinching. What about you? Have you ever had to choose between staying silent to protect your image or speaking up to protect your values? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.